Authentication. HTTP Authentication. HTTP provides a general framework for access control and authentication. This page is an introduction to the HTTP framework for authentication and shows how to restrict access to your server using the HTTP basic scheme. The general HTTP authentication framework. RFC 7235 defines the HTTP authentication framework, which can be used by a server to challenge a client request and by a client to provide authentication information. The challenge and response flow works like this. The server responds to a client with 401 unauthorized response status and provides information on how to authorize with a www authenticated response header containing at least one challenge. A client that wants to authenticate itself with the server can then do so by including an authorization request header with the credentials. Usually, a client will present a password prompt to the user and will then issue the request including the correct authorization header. The general message flow above is the same for most authentication schemes. The actual information in the headers and the way it is encoded does change. Warning: the basic authentication scheme used in the diagram above sends the credentials encoded but not encrypted. This would be completely insecure unless the exchange was over a secure connection. Proxy authentication. The same challenge and response mechanism can be used for proxy authentication, as both resource authentication and proxy authentication can coexist. A different set of headers and status codes is needed. In this case of proxies, the challenge status code is 407 proxy authentication required. The proxy authenticated response header contains at least one challenge applicable to the proxy, and the proxy authorization request header is used for providing the credentials to the proxy server. Access forbidden. If a server receives invalid credentials, it should respond with a 401 unauthorized or with a 407 proxy authentication required. And the user may send a new request or replace the authorization header field. If a server receives valid credentials that are inadequate to access a given resource, the server should respond with a 403 forbidden status code, unlike 401 unauthorized or 407 proxy authentication required. Authentication is impossible for this user, and browsers will not propose a new attempt. In all cases, the server may prefer returning a 404 not found with status code to hide the existence of the page to a user without adequate privileges or not correctly authenticated. Authentication of cross-origin images. A potential security hole that has since been fixed in browsers was authentication of cross-site images. From Firefox 59 onwards, image resources loaded from different origins to the current document are no longer able to trigger HTTP authentication dialogues, preventing user credentials being stolen if attackers were able to embed an arbitrary image into a third party's page. Character encoding of HTTP authentication. Browsers use UTF-8 encoding for usernames and passwords. Firefox once used ISO 88591, but changed to UTF-8 for parity with other browsers and to avoid potential problems as described in Firefox bug. www authenticate and proxy authenticate headers. The www authenticate and proxy authenticate response headers define the authentication method that should be used to get access to a resource. They must specify which authentication scheme is used, so that the client that wishes to authorize knows how to provide the credentials. The syntax for these headers is the following. Here, type is the authentication scheme. Basic is the most common scheme and introduced below. The realm is used to describe the protected area or to indicate the scope of protection. This could be a message like access to the staging site or similar, so that the user knows to which space they are trying to get access to. Authorization and proxy authorization header. The authorization and proxy authorization request header contains the credentials to authenticate a user agent with a server. Here, type is needed again, followed by the credentials, which can be encoded or encrypted depending on which authentication scheme is used. Authentication schemes. The general HTTP authentication framework is the best for a number of authentication schemes. IANA maintains a list of authentication schemes. There are other schemes offered by host service, such as Amazon AWS. Some common authentication schemes include Basic, Bearer, Digest, HOPA, Mutual, Negotiate, Vapid, SCARM, AWS 4 HMAC SHA-256. Schemes can differ in security strengths and in their availability in client or server software. The basic authentication scheme offers very poor security but is widely supported and easy to set up. It is introduced in more detail below. The basic HTTP authentication scheme is defined in RFC 7617, which transmits credentials as user ID password pairs encoded using base 64. Security of basic authentication. As the user ID and the password are parsed over the network as clear text, it is base 64 encoded, but the base 64 is a misvertible encoding. The basic authentication scheme is not secure. HTTPS TLS should be used with basic authentication to prevent credential interception. In addition, sites that use HTTP basic auths are particularly vulnerable to cross-site request forgery attacks, because the user credentials are set in all requests regardless of origin. This differs cookie-based credential mechanisms because cookies are commonly blocked in cross-site requests. Sites should always use the post requests when changing data and include CSRF tokens. Without these security enhancements, basic authentication should not be used to protect sensitive or vulnerable information. Restricting access with Apache and basic authentication. To password protect a directory on an Apache server, you will need a .htaccess and a .ht password file. The .htaccess access file typically looks like this. The .ht access file references a .ht password file in which each line consists of a username and a password separated by a colon. You cannot see the actual passwords as they are hashed using MD5-based hashing in this case. Note that you can name your .ht password file differently if you like. But keep in mind, this file shouldn't be accessible to anyone. Apache is usually configured to prevent access to .ht files. Restricting access with Nginx and basic authentication. For Nginx, you will need to specify a location that you are going to protect and the HTTP basic directive that provides the name to the password protected area. The auth basic user file directive then points to a .ht password file that contains the encrypted user credentials, just like in the Apache example above. Access using credentials in the URL. Historically, some sites would allow you to log in using an encoded URL containing the username and the password as shown. This syntax is no longer allowed in modern browsers. The username and password are stripped from the request before it is sent.